Our speaker today is Wally Mills. Wally is an historian with a PhD in African history from UCLA. His area of concentration is South African history, but in 37 years of teaching at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, he also taught modern British and European history, including a senior seminar on the 2 world wars. In 2005, he retired from full-time appointment, but continued to offer courses on the internet part-time. He has just retired from that also. He and his wife moved to Ajijic in May 2008. He's going to speak to us about why equality is better for everyone. Wally Mills.
Good morning. Good morning. Now, Barbara, my wife, and I have been pretty regular in attending Open Circle, but I think that most of you don't know us. So I thought that I would introduce myself by telling our story. Not that it's especially unique. In February 2008, we came to visit our friends Kate and Jack for 1 week. Now, we weren't looking for a southern home or to move from Canada. I came because Kate had started a blog, and I was very much intrigued by her descriptions of Mexico, which were so far different from my stereotypes. On the other hand, Barbara was reluctant to come even for a visit. You all know the drill. Dusty, dangerous Mexico, right? Anyway, she came. And it was Barbara. After 3 days, she said, "I think we should move here." Barbara is, as you can tell, not indecisive. Well, here's the short version of the rest of the story. After looking at 6 houses and short negotiations, on the 6th day, we signed an agreement to buy a house in La Foresta. Then, well, like God, we rested on the 7th day. Anyway, not too long ago, I was telling this story to another couple, and they said, well, when we bought our house, it was on the 4th day. Well, unlike us, they had done a lot of research before and had pretty well decided before they came. So, I don't say they cheated, but they did have a head start. Anyway, whether or not that's a good way to make such important decisions, we've never regretted moving here. Now, I wanted to talk about this book, The Spirit Level, because it's so important in documenting and explaining why some of our richest industrialized countries are increasingly becoming such failures in social terms. Its subtitle is more revealing: Why Equality is Better for Everyone. You may have heard about it already because I've seen columnists in the New York Times and the Toronto Globe and Mail refer to it. The authors, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, are British epidemiologists who collectively claim over 50 years of research and study statistics about health outcomes. Now, we all know that the complex of changes which we usually describe as the Industrial Revolution has dramatically increased the productivity and wealth of human societies. The transformation had both costs and benefits, and very often those were not shared equitably. Some sections of society bore most of the costs, and other sections, in fact, got most of the benefits. Nevertheless, over time, populations in industrialized, developed societies have experienced dramatic improvements, such as increased life expectancy, markedly declining mortality rates, especially among the young, and a virtual end to the kind of scarcity and want that faced the majority of our species in the past. Now we're witnessing the same transformations taking place in China, India, and Brazil. Now the actual reasons for the improvements are many, especially, of course, the improvements in medical knowledge. But we tend to conflate all the reasons into one overriding explanation: greater wealth. As the collective wealth of society increases, many things get better. Now, a good deal of the work of epidemiologists has given support to this idea. When societies are evaluated on the basis of income groups, the highest income group, on average, does better than the lower income groups. That group lives longer, has better health outcomes, and better social conditions. And that correlation tends to go right down the income scale, as on average, every group does better than those below it, and not quite as good as those above it. Now, you all know the famous quip, okay? I've been rich and I've been poor. Rich is better. So it seems on the surface that that quip hits the nail on the head, but remember, on the surface. By the way, Kate and I had a disagreement, so I looked it up. That quip has been attributed to various people: Mae West, Sophie Tucker, W.C. Fields, among others. So take your pick as to who you want to attribute it to. But, and this is a huge but, when the epidemiologists began to compare different societies, what they found was totally unexpected and seemed anomalous. The United States is the richest country in the world by virtually any measure, especially by per capita income. The claims about imminent bankruptcy of the United States by various politicians and talk jocks is nonsense. Okay? It's all Chicken Little. Now, only Norway comes close to the United States as measured by per capita GNP. So, if rich is better, the United States should be at the top, right? Well, let's take life expectancy. The U.S. is not at the top. It's not second or third or even in the top 10. In fact, out of 23 countries compared in this book, the United States is 20th out of 23. Except for Norway, the nations that are at the top in life expectancy all have per capita incomes that are 25 to 35% lower than those of the United States. In fact, Greece and Israel have higher life expectancy with just over half the per capita income of the United States. And among the 23 compared, there's no correlation between income levels and life expectancy. So maybe the joke about rich being better isn't so poignant after all. But this is only the beginning. When the epidemiologists, and not just Wilkinson and Pickett, but a whole raft of others as well, looked at the measures of health and social well-being, the same pattern emerged again and again. What were those other measures? The authors identified 9 measures for which they could get statistics for comparison. Level of trust, mental illness, including drug and alcohol addictions, obesity, life expectancy and mortality. By the way, don't have to write these down, there's no test. 5th is teenage births, children's educational performance, homicides, imprisonment rates, and social mobility. Now, on all these measures of well-being, the United States came out at or near the bottom. And when the authors put them all together in one single index, the United States was not only last, 23rd out of 23, but in fact it was up off the scale, away from everyone else. Now, part of the explanation for this, as I'm sure you recognize, is that on some measures, homicides and imprisonment rates, the United States is in a category all by itself. Now, on the other hand, there was consistency at the top as well. The same countries tended to come out at or near the top on every measure. Not 100%, but pretty damn close. Now, I mentioned that the book compares 23 countries. So, which countries are those and how were they chosen? The authors started with the 50 richest countries in the world, laid out by one of the world bodies, okay? And then eliminated some for various reasons. Eliminated were those that had a population less than 3 million, and those for whom there were not reliable or adequate statistics. Then they were left with 16 European countries, Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Japan, and Israel. All of these are democracies and developed countries with capitalist economic systems. So, if income is not the explanation on these 9 measures, and statistically there's no correlation, then what's the explanation? The only correlation the authors and other researchers found was the level of income inequality in each society. That is, societies that have lower inequality have better outcomes than those that have high levels of income inequality. Those in the middle have outcomes in the middle. In other words, it's on a scale. Okay? The lower the income inequality, the better the outcomes. This means that people in lower inequality countries live longer, have lower rates of addiction and mental illness, lower obesity, fewer homicides, better educational performance, etc. What's not to like? Now, I deliberately talk about levels of inequality rather than equality, because no country comes anywhere near equality of income. Thus, those who argue that equality is deadening and fatal to initiative don't have to get worried or excited. Okay? There's no danger, and or even a need to strive for complete equality. Even a bit less inequality has significant benefits. But really, how much inequality are we talking about? There are a number of ways to measure inequality, and all produce pretty much the same ranking. The authors, in their comparisons of different countries, use a fairly simple approach. In each society, they compare the 20% with the highest incomes with the 20% with the lowest incomes. In 4 countries, Japan, Sweden, Finland, and Norway, the richest 20% on average have incomes just under 4 times the lowest 20%. In the next 10 countries, the richest 20% have 4 to 6 times the income of the lowest 20%. 9 countries have greater disparities, including Britain, over 7 times, and the United States, about 8.5 times the gap. Only Singapore, at almost 10 times, exceeds the United States. Now, these statistics for the book relate to 2002 to 2005. I would say it's likely that the inequalities are greater with the Bush tax cuts and the high levels of unemployment that we've seen since 2008. Now, the authors show a very high degree of correlation between the degree of income inequality and how well or badly societies compare on the 9 measures. One of the measures, social mobility, is, I think, especially significant, at least symbolically. This is something that Americans have long prided themselves, especially in comparison to the class-ridden societies of Europe in previous eras. America was the land of opportunity, where everyone with drive and ambition could climb the social and economic ladder. Now, measuring social mobility is difficult. It takes longitudinal studies of at least 30 years to compare how sons do in comparison with their fathers. The authors were able to find studies for only 8 countries out of the 23. So it's not absolutely definitive. However, those with lower inequality were bunched near the top as far as social mobility was concerned. Britain was farther down, and the United States was again dead last, okay, of those 8 countries. Moreover, an American study showed that social mobility in the United States increased from 1950 until about 1980. And then sharp decline after that. And that, of course, is precisely when income inequality began to increase dramatically in the United States. So obviously, there are some individuals, especially in computers and technology, Bill Gates and so on, who amass enormous wealth when they're young. However, they are very much exceptions. It seems that for the majority, individuals have difficulty equaling the status of their parents, let alone bettering it. The status of sons is largely predicted by the status of their fathers. Upward mobility is more a dream and a myth than a reality. Now, to test their findings about income inequality and outcomes, the authors also compare states in the United States on 8 of the measures. They couldn't do it on social mobility. Now, all their statistics are from official U.S. statistical agencies, including U.S. Census Bureau. The Department of Justice has a statistical branch as well. When each of the measures of well-being is compared with the Gini coefficient, that's a measure of inequality that the U.S. Census Bureau calculates, the same pattern emerges as between countries. People in states with less inequality do better than people in states with greater inequality. There's a little more scatter in the plotting of the different states because there are often other factors besides income inequality that are affecting the outcome. Alaska is a good example. You all know about Alaska. Okay, Alaska is one of the low inequality states. And on most measures, it's in line with other states with a similar level of inequality. However, on one measure, homicide rate, Alaska has a much higher rate than others of similar levels of inequality. So, different. Well, it also turns out that Alaska has one of the highest rates of gun ownership. So, maybe that's the explanation for the divergence on this measure. The book is organized with a chapter on each of the 9 measures. And the authors try to provide explanations why levels of inequality have such significant effects on health and so on. A lot of the explanation appears to be related to the fact that we humans don't assess our status and well-being by objective criteria. Rather, we compare ourselves with other people in our own society. We evaluate our lot by comparing what we have with what other people and our neighbors have. Status is, of course, determined by more than one criterion: wealth, education levels, profession, and birth. However, even in Europe, birth is decreasing in importance in terms of status, and wealth is more and more significant because wealth affects consumption patterns. Wealth and high income enable people to acquire the things that convey status. The greater the differences in wealth, the greater the differences in consumption patterns and the differences in status. And where there are great disparities of wealth, people in society are ranked on a steeply rising hierarchy. Most people are preoccupied with at least maintaining their ranking on the hierarchy. And the authors argue that much of the increased anxiety and the recent behaviors that led to such a mess recently can perhaps be traced to this problem. the rich and super rich are constantly raising the bar. But it's not just the rich and the super rich. People are concerned with those immediately above them and below them. So, keeping up with the Joneses is a treadmill that keeps going faster and faster. Okay? And keeping up becomes harder and harder. Is this then why so many people took on so much debt when incomes of those in the middle were stagnating, as indeed they have done since the 1970s? Bigger and grander houses and other elements of conspicuous consumption in a desperate attempt to keep up. Now, we do know from a lot of studies that anxiety has very significant negative mental and physical effects. Okay? People who are anxious are in fact less healthy. Now, as social distances increase, feelings of connectedness and empathy decrease. We no longer care as much for other people. Trust in other people and society goes down. Now, the author's discussion of these effects are much more extensive than I can give here, but they are indeed extensive. They also talk about happiness. And there are surveys that try to gauge how happy people in different countries are. However, the authors agree that these tend to be subjective and are influenced by cultural attitudes. For example, Japanese tend to be self-deprecating, while it's said that Americans are the opposite. Some even say that Americans are boastful, but I didn't say I said that. In any case, such cultural differences would affect how people respond to survey questions. However, in the same society, surveys over time can give an indication of how happiness and satisfaction is perceived and is changing. In the US, polls are pretty consistent in showing that the majority of Americans are not happy about the way things are going, and in agreeing that the best days are behind for the US. That is, levels of satisfaction are much lower than they were a few decades ago, and seem to be still going down with the economic crisis that's continuing to deepen. Now, we might assume that with the huge and growing disparity in incomes in the US, that the explanation for the worst outcomes is that people at the bottom are dragging down the averages. And it is true that as one goes down the income scale, the outcomes are worse. But that's true in every society, not just the US. And this isn't the entire story. The stunning thing is that the rich in more unequal societies don't do as well as you might expect. In a comparison of the richest 20% in the United States with the richest 20% in Sweden, and remember that the average of the American rich is a lot higher than that of the rich Swedes. The Swedes do better on every measure, including life expectancy. And as you go down the scale, Swedes in every income category do better than their American counterparts, in spite of the fact that American income averages are higher. Thus, the costs of greater inequality are spread across the entire society, even the rich. Now, this is not to claim that Sweden is, everything is wonderful there. In Sweden, too, the gap between rich and poor has increased since the 1960s. Many Swedes lament that equality and solidarity are no longer valued like they were in the 1960s. There's more crime. 2 leading politicians have been assassinated. There's also been substantial immigration. About 11% of the population in Sweden are now non-Swedes. And the immigrants are not integrating well into Swedish society. So there are problems in Sweden too. Now, the issue of immigration raises another point. Some critics of the spirit level have suggested that the differences in outcomes as measured measures of social well-being aren't due to income inequality. Instead, they argue that it's due to homogeneity or heterogeneity of the population. That is, the good showing of Japan and the Nordic countries is due to the homogeneity of their populations, while the poor showing of the United States is due to its great heterogeneity. Japan is certainly a very homogeneous country, and this argument has a superficial plausibility for that. However, on the other hand, Portugal is also fairly homogeneous, yet its high level of income inequality, almost equal to that of the United States. As a result, its outcomes are often just above those of the United States. In other words, its outcomes are just about where its level of inequality would predict they would be. Moreover, during the last 30 or 40 years, European societies, as I mentioned, including Sweden, have experienced a great deal of immigration from outside of Europe. They are much less homogeneous than the critics recognize. However, the real counter to this argument is Canada. Canada has had so much immigration from Africa, Asia, the Middle East, even from the Western Hemisphere, that it's not far behind the United States in terms of heterogeneity. Yet Canada, with a lower level of inequality, scores higher on all measures than does the United States. Another interesting fact revealed by the researchers is that it does not seem to matter how a society achieves lower levels of inequality. The Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, do this by higher taxes and a broad range of government-funded services. That is, redistribution of income. On the other hand, Japan, which has the lowest level of inequality of any of the 23, has also the lowest level of government-funded services. Japan, after its defeat and with the need for unity to rebuild the devastated country, had a relatively small gap between top and bottom incomes. And it has not experienced the explosion of top incomes that we have experienced since the 1970s. Remember when actors, entertainers, top athletes all began demanding and getting bigger paydays? Then top executives got on the same bandwagon, and it hasn't stopped yet. Now, Wilkinson and Pickett do not prescribe how inequality should be reduced. They argue that all the options are open. However, short of another world war, that's what it took last time to collapse the disparities, I think the genie's out of the bottle. Who's going to be willing to see their incomes go down? I think that redistribution via taxes and expanded government services is the most realistic option. But raising minimum wages and strengthening trade unions might do a lot in that direction as well. Now, one of the things the authors talk about, which I think deserves more emphasis, is the extreme cult of the individual that has been adopted by so many Americans, and Brits too. The works of Ayn Rand have been especially influential. I've read only one of her works, but I wasn't particularly impressed. From what I can remember, her heroic individual is a kind of watered-down version of Friedrich Nietzsche's Superman. Okay? Rand contemptuously dismissed altruism as an ethical or philosophical principle unworthy of consideration. Altruism is concern about others and willingness to sacrifice one's own interests for the benefit of others or for the public good. Rand, instead, advocated rational egoism, what we might characterize as me first, me last, me always. Her political ideology, laissez-faire liberalism, usually nowadays called conservatism or neoconservatism in the United States, denigrated obligations to the group and most uses of government to perform tasks that serve the general good of society. Now, we've witnessed how enthusiastically these moral principles advocated by Rand have been adopted by Wall Street and other bankers almost everywhere. Greed is good has been the mantra for so many. And for over 30 years, politicians, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and a long list of others, have labored incessantly to reduce our governments to impotence. Now, as we look at the increasing social and economic devastation of so many developed nations, we can see where, in my view at least, rational egoism and neoconservatism have brought us. But there's a problem in logic, I think. Rand explicitly assumes that self-interest and altruism are opposite, and more or less either-or proposition. But is it easy to decide what's in one's self-interest? Which is better? To have lower taxes and therefore greater income to spend on conspicuous status consumption, as is the current rate, or to pay higher taxes to reduce income inequality and therefore be healthier, have less stress, have more community, and live longer, all the things that less unequal societies enjoy. Which is more rational? It appears to me at least that altruism is in one's self-interest. Therefore, I think Rand's philosophy is shallow and short-sighted. In any case, extreme individualism is not appropriate for humans. Some species do live solitary lives as individuals, bears, leopards, such like. However, we humans have survived and thrived only in groups. The reason isn't hard to find. Rearing human infants is a demanding, long-term task. No individual or even couple can successfully rear children to adulthood on their own. It's a task for a community, for a larger group. Moreover, the evolution from small hunter-gatherer societies to modern industrial societies has enormously increased, not diminished, the task of preparing human infants to live and perform in our complex world. Our species has always lived in groups. We've depended on cooperation and lots of altruism. Now, I know that my version of this debate about whether unceasing competition or cooperation has been more important in human evolution gets very crude. The authors give a more comprehensive argument. But the research is building up. Recently, David Brooks, you may know him as a New York Times conservative columnist, had an article recently reviewing books and studies which are showing that cooperation and interdependence has been more characteristic of human society than used to be asserted by social Darwinists and other evolutionary anthropologists. What this means, I think, is that we're getting evidence from two directions. That extreme individualism espoused by those like Rand is not appropriate. The research increasingly questions the premises on which their theories are based. However, even more significantly, our experience indicates that since we began to follow this path in the 1970s, things have been getting worse. Now, you may think I've been picking on the United States, especially when Britain has closely followed the results in the United States. However, as unquestionably the richest society on earth, the dismal showing by the United States on so many measures of well-being is the most surprising and stark example. Moreover, American researchers have provided the most extensive examination of social outcomes. Thus, the United States is the best guinea pig and laboratory for examining these theories and ideas. Also, I can guess that some of you may be thinking, ah, yes, another smug Canadian. And it's true that in comparison with the US and Britain, Canada does well. But I'm not smug for a couple of reasons. First, Canada is too close to the United States to escape the effects. Pierre Trudeau once described Canada's position, saying that it was like sleeping in bed with an elephant. Okay? Any twitch of the beast could bring dire consequences. But there's more. The authors of The Spirit Level give Canada too much credit. At one point, they say that alone among the English-speaking democracies, Canada has not followed the US and Britain down the road to greater income inequality. However, just last December, Statistics Canada released a research study which shows that in Canada too, income inequality has been increasing during the last 25 years. Thus, the best that can be said for Canada is that we've not gone as fast or as far as the others. Moreover, the current government of Stephen Harper in Canada, which just won a majority, seems determined to take Canada as quickly as possible in the direction of the United States. For example, they are proposing a tough-on-crime program of longer prison sentences, despite the evidence that the crime rates are falling, and despite the evidence of what a disaster these have been in the United States. Look at California going broke. In short, then, we in Canada are following the other lemmings toward the precipice. Now, in my view, laissez-faire liberalism in its modern reincarnation, neoconservatism, is really a religion. Of course, Adam Smith started off with all that hocus pocus about the invisible hand. We are told that the free market is omniscient, never makes a mistake. The free market is self-regulating and should never, ever be regulated by fallible government. We are urged to bow down and worship this transcendent entity, the market. But like other gods, this is a god that we humans have created ourselves. I mean, what's a market? A market is simply two or more humans getting together and exchanging things. It can be relatively local, like the Angus, or it can be worldwide. Nevertheless, markets, however large or however small, are still something that we humans create. Because they are created by humans, they are, like us, fallible. We should have learned, I think, because there have been frequent examples of fallible markets, from the tulip madness in the 18th century to the recent mortgage and derivatives meltdown. It's not magic. It's not anything supernatural. There is no omniscient, transcendent market in the sky. And I know I sound like an atheist. You're saying there's no Big Daddy in the sky. I always insist that I'm an agnostic, not an atheist, but I know for a lot of people that's a distinction without a difference. In any case, I don't believe there's a supernatural market that'll look after things for us. Okay? We have to look after ourselves. Now, it all seems like a time warp. In the years following the Great Depression and the Second World War, our populations turned away from laissez-faire and other fantasy theories. They rebuilt from the enormous wartime devastation and created the most dramatic period of prosperity the world has ever known. And this was done on the basis of a balance between public and private enterprise. If the balance tips too far one way or the other, the results are not good. In my view, why is China doing so well presently? Well, for decades after the creation of the People's Republic, almost everything was decided by the state, with disastrous results. Now, opening up to private enterprise has enabled the Chinese economy to thrive. But the state is still massively involved in building infrastructure and funding research and so on. So, China has moved toward a better balance. Meanwhile, in the U.S., the role of government has been massively reduced and the balance tilted. And contrary to fairy tales spread by neoconservatism, there are a great many economically necessary tasks that the private sector will not and cannot do. If government or the state is reduced to impotence, those tasks aren't done. Economic momentum is lost, and the quality of life declines. Now, the spirit level seems to me is important because, and these are my comments, the authors are more circumspect than I am. The spirit level is important because it shows what the consequences are. If we ignore the evidence, what are the prospects for our democratic societies? Now, I know that most of you, like me, don't have to be convinced that greed and selfishness are not high moral virtues. That high levels of inequality and disparities of income are not positive characteristics of our society. The surprise in the spirit level is that the evidence is so overwhelming that we are all worse off because of it. For over 30 years, the proponents of laissez-faire and neoconservatism has dominated public debate. Now, they agree. Unregulated competition, with government prevented from redistributing income via taxes, leads to great disparities of income and inequality. But they don't argue with that, okay? They agree. What they claim is that inequality is good, okay? Why? Because they claim people with high incomes won't spend it all and will instead invest the extra money. The investment will produce jobs, and eventually everyone, even the poor, will be better off. This is the famous or infamous trickle-down theory. Now, Wilkinson and Pickett and the other researchers whom they cite, 200 studies, which they cite in this book, are correct. That is, that inequality in fact makes things worse. Then the entire rationale for neoconservatism is destroyed. Okay? Inequality is not good. Now, we only have to look around to see that squalor is increasing, and our recent experience indicates that we are not doing better economically. I think it's time we push back. In my view, neoconservatism is an example of the emperor's new clothes. Remember the kid that said, but he has no clothes on? Okay. And I want to reemphasize, these last comments are mine, not the author's. They're much more circumspect than I am. They mostly just present the evidence, okay, without trying to show exactly where they might lead. Anyway, there's a great deal more in the book, but I wanted to leave questions, so I'll stop at that point.
Thank you, Wally. So raise your hand and somebody will bring you a mic. I believe somebody will. There.
Thank you. We so-called gringos appear to live a very good life down here. And we have advantages that the Mexican people in this region may not have. But I had a very interesting conversation about a year or two ago with a Mexican gentleman who said, you know, senor, he says, we Mexicans are not envious of you gringos. He says, you are very mercenary, you're very materialistic, you're very acquisitive. He says, we can live with the things that God has given us here in a state of happiness. We have our families and we have our church and we're happy, probably more so than you people are. That was very good insight. What's the
As an ex-Canadian, I've been down here 14 years and been back in Canada for 6 years. But my question is, many years ago, Canada rated very, very high. I don't know where it is in that book. Why is it then, in your opinion, that so many Canadians are prepared to give up all these things to live in another country?
Okay, well, I can't speak for all Canadians. I can only talk about myself. And for me, well, Barbara felt better down here. Her health is better down here than it was at home. But for me, the main thing was the adventure. Okay, I wanted to learn about another culture, and I'm diligently going to Spanish class every week and so on. So I reached an age where I was still healthy, I retired, and I thought, I'd have an adventure. So I came down here, and being down here, of course, there are so many advantages. The weather, especially being dominant there. But, you know, it was, we came and love to hear. So that's why.
Yeah, I want you to comment on you saying that government is getting less and less influence, and yet the civil service is increasing relentlessly. It seems like they're interfering more and more with our lives rather than less and less.
With regard to bureaucracies, I know that's something we all love to hate. You know, there needs to be a balance. That's, I think, what I would particularly argue. And what I mentioned very briefly is that unless there is a balance, things don't work very well. And particularly, well, you know, compared to the United States after 1945, had high taxes and lots of regulation, and according to neoconservative theory, should have been disaster, okay? Stagnation, etc., etc. It wasn't. Then we've had deregulation, we have had tax cuts and so on, and what have we had since then? Well, I count at least three major economic crises: savings and loan debacle, the dot-com burst bubble, and now the latest one here. So it seems to me that, in fact, the crises are, in fact, getting worse, and so on. So I'm not advocating huge bureaucracies or saying that they make everything better. And not necessarily, as the authors agree, it doesn't necessarily have to be you know, large government programs, as long as the inequalities in income are evened out. So if you do it another way, with you know, higher minimum wages, strengthen the unions so there's a better balance between management and unions, then you can get a better balance in income. So, you know, there's more than one way to get to the same goal.
The civil service is increasing relentlessly. Washington is the only place in the United States where real estate is going up.
Amen.
Could you ask him to repeat that a little more?
Is that a bad thing? I don't think it's bad.
Yeah, the title is The Spirit Level,
That's the
the
title,
book.
yes.
And where does France stand in all this mess?
Okay,
Having
France,
lived there and would like to live there again.
yeah. It's one of those countries that's very close to Canada, kind of in the middle, okay? Along with Germany and several other countries.
Some years ago, PBS did a program on happiness and relative to various countries. And if I remember correctly, it was either Denmark or one of the northern countries, Denmark, that was seen as the happiest. And the reason had to do with the lowest level of expectation. My question is, in the book, is there any kind of discussion between inequality and lack of expectation relative to happiness?
Well, I think what the main argument that they make is that, in fact, the problem is too high expectations in most countries. And particularly where there's large gaps in the income, people are striving to get ahead. And this makes for some of the anxiety and so on that leads to problems. Now, you know, if you have lower expectations, perhaps that helps to keep up. What their argument is that where the income inequality is lower, expectations are lower. People are more satisfied with what they have.
I have been living here for 17 years and witnessing the deterioration of the United States because of the greed is good theory, which started many years ago by one particular person, as opposed to when you were talking about children. Hillary Clinton wrote, "It takes a village to raise a child." And I have absolutely nothing that I disagree with you having to do with the United States at this time. And I congratulate you on your speech. I found it very interesting.
Thank you very much.
thing that I'm missed very conspicuously, and I haven't read the book, so I don't know if it's mentioned, belief systems and attitude. Because I think along with all this is each individual's attitude to his universe in whichever way he wants to interpret it. And I think that religions, philosophies, whatever, have sadly disappointed humanity, the ones that we have at the moment, because they haven't given us a belief system very similar to the Mexican that the gentleman mentioned. We're not satisfied with what we've got. We're always striving for things that are really quite unnecessary. You're talking about China doing better, but they're wanting to emulate the States. And what's going to happen? More and more power, more and more materialism, more and more breakdown. I don't think that's good.
No.
So, that's my...
Yeah, no, and that's very interesting and appropriate comment, because in the book, and I haven't brought it out in my talk here, right at the end, they talk about what this means. Most of the book is simply the statistical research and so on that they have done, comparing health outcomes, so not worrying about that. But they do go in here and talk about what this means in a world where resources are increasingly being depleted, where we're facing more pollution and so on. And so they, in fact, argue that we are going to have to look at these issues of values and what we think are important and so on. So the authors do talk about that. I didn't bring that up in my presentation. Yes?
Is economic geography ever discussed in the book?
No.
Qualities on the climate and industrialized countries versus under-industrial.
Okay.
Can you repeat the question?
What was the question?
Oh, is there a discussion of economic geography, and whether there's a discussion, therefore, if some areas are more deprived and so on than other areas? And I would say no, they don't talk about that. What they do say is this, that in fact, increasing wealth with industrialization has many benefits. And they continue, but at a certain point, they begin to level off, okay? That in fact, increases have less and less benefit, okay? And so in fact, you're getting a lot of diminishing returns. And what they argue is that in most of our industrial society, we've gotten beyond that point, okay? We're getting to that point where further increases in wealth do not bring any significant benefits in terms of happiness or well-being or so on. So what they're arguing is that we, in these countries, have to start thinking about these other things, okay, the values, what's important, how we are going to survive on this planet when we are polluting it and using up its resources so very, very quickly. So they're saying that we are at a crisis point because not only are what we have non-sustainable, but with all the other countries like China and India and so on have huge populations that at the moment are still suffering the problems of poverty. And so we must allow them to, achieve greater wealth in order to have longer life expectancy and so on. And that means that we, which are taking more than our fair share of the wealth and so on, have to change the way we approach things.
I think we have time for just one last question.
Well, thank you again for your time and your knowledge. As a woman, I heard a lot of things that I don't think are apparent in a woman's life. And first of all, I would like to speak about aging. I live in Abbeyfield, which is a space for older people. And people say there are no Mexicans that live there. And I say, well, of course there are no Mexicans that live there. The Mexicans take care of their older people. Their older people are revered, they're valued. Now, I don't know what slot that fits in. I don't know whether that is a slot of economics, on health, but I would say it is slot on its own. And then I would also like to say that I got my greatest compliment from the woman who sells the toilet paper up at the plaza for 3 pesos for the Mexicans to use the bathroom. And I think that's quite wonderful because I've toured in many countries where the men especially do not bother to go to the bathroom. I sit at the table next in the plaza to her, and she says, tell the waiter, I think that woman is a very lovely woman because she smiles and always speaks to me. So I think this connection and knowing that we are all part of Earth, we're all one, is what needs to be spread. And how it's spread, I don't know. But I do know that this particular community is outstanding in its giving and appreciation of each other as human beings.
I agree.
It seems that I got the last question. Oh, don't stand up. My question is about the book. Oh, close to my mouth, okay. The changes in the world and how we adapt to it. In that mentions, I mean, I come from the Netherlands and we learned to talk together very early because if you live in a polder with a dike around it, if the dike breaks, we all die. So we learn to talk together. And that capacity now seems to be lost. There is so many changes in the world. There's the internet and all that. So the old rules don't apply exactly anymore. But if we keep on talking together, then maybe we can find a solution. That's the equality that seems to be lost. The book mention anything?
Well, that in fact is one of the main things, that in fact empathy and conversations and so on goes down as inequality increases. So that, that reversing that is the only way that we can in fact become much more interdependent and much more community-minded.
Thank you. Our speaker next week is journalist Kelly Hayes-Raitt, who is an award-winning writer, and her great interest is the Mideast, especially Iraq. So please pick up your coffee cups and stack the chairs by color and style. Thank you for coming. We'll see you next Sunday.